Despite providing its neighbors with extensive financial and technological aid, security guarantees, and humanitarian assistance during natural disasters, political crises, and recently health emergencies, India struggles to win their trust and shake away the Big Brother label. Feelings of resentment towards India's alleged interference in internal affairs of its neighbors, disregard towards their political, economic, and cultural sensitivities in India's policies and rhetoric, and perceived disdain of Indians towards their fellow South Asians are shared widely across the region. Even India's belated Neighbourhood First Policy, initiated by PM Modi, has not been able to rekindle the frosty relations with its neighbors. Many in India's foreign policy establishment have argued that India's disproportionately large size, military strength, and economic potential relative to its neighbors make such anxieties inevitable, and hence there is little India can do to allay them. However, such grievances, real or imagined, have serious implications for India's security, trade prospects, and its political aspirations of regional and global leadership. To be taken seriously on the world stage, India will have to first earn the respect and goodwill of its immediate neighbors. Therefore, instead of dismissing it, we believe it is important to have an open and balanced debate on this question. Does India play Big Brother to its neighbors? To this end, we are joined by an eminent panel of some of India's top foreign affairs experts. We have with us um, Dr. Dr. S.D. Muni. He's Professor Emeritus at the School of International Studies, JNU, and the member of Executive Council of Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis.
No longer.
Okay, please correct me, sir.
Last month, I completed my term.
Okay, noted. And he has served as India's ambassador as well as member of the National Security Advisory Board of India. We have Mr. Parmeet Pal Chaudhary, who's senior advisor at Rhodium Group and leads the firm's Indian research. He's also the foreign editor of Hindustan Times and fellow and head of strategic affairs at Ananta Aspen Center of India. He has also been a member of India's National Security Advisory Board. We have Dr. Pallavi Raghavan, who's Assistant Professor of International Relations at Ashoka University. And we have Dr. Kimraj Jangid, who's Associate Professor and Director of Jindal Center for Israel Studies at Jindal School of International Affairs. Welcome all of you to Argumentative Indians. It's an honor to have you with us. I would like to, for my opening question, I would like to bring out a view which has often been mentioned to explain some of this Big Brother image. There's an argument that India has, or New Delhi has inherited from its colonial masters, the imperial mindset, which reflects in its interactions with its neighbors, resulting in India thinking of the entire South Asia as its exclusive sphere of influence. Dr. Raghavan, what is your view? What is the truth in this view?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I just wanted to start by saying that, it's such a pleasure for me to participate in a panel with such august and distinguished company, all of whom are in fact much better placed to be able to answer this question much more than I am. For myself, I'm just eager to hear what their opinions are about this question. I'm a historian by training, and I thought, since I'm beginning, I thought I'd just take a couple of minutes to offer a historian's perspective on this question, and to try to answer not whether or not India has a big brother attitude towards its neighborhood, but to try to provide a bit of context about just how this big brother kind of gaze was first kind of set up. And a lot of these debates, I always find it's really interesting how many of these debates have have a kind of curious kind of salience with debates about India and its region that were first had in the 19th century, and how many resonances there are about India's external kind of way of thinking. How many saliences there are with thinking that was first done in the 19th century, and the kind of legacies that carries over for us today. And one of the reasons I say this is because, one of the kind of, priorities for the colonial state was to protect its Indian possession by kind of trying to ring fence its frontiers from the threat of invasion. And, the thinking developed by, successive viceroys, including most kind of notably Curzon, was that the best way of kind of securing India's frontier was to have the approach or have the policy of a frontier zone, and buffer states that would kind of surround India's periphery, who would sort of, in essence, be zones that were, whose job, according to Curzon sitting in Delhi, was just to be the kind of place that would not offer up or be a launching pad for any threat to the territorial integrity of India, and that was all that place was sort of envisioned as. I mean, it's not like that place had a sense of identity of its own, or it had or it could have kind of tried to conceptualize its role in some different way, according to the buffer, according to the 19th century buffer zone kind of way of thinking. All those peripheral zones could do was just to kind of act as frontiers, for the defense of India. And there's, there are, numerous examples of this way of thinking, and there's a reason why so many debates about India's neighborhood kind of, you find so many books kind of about the 19th century suddenly springing up in discussions about Afghanistan or Nepal or Myanmar or Bhutan. So there's a reason that 19th century kind of approaches to India's territorial security continue to have saliences today. So it's working with that kind of, it's working, the big brotherhood, big brother kind of question is also working with that kind of mindset. And I think what we have to kind of make up our minds about is whether that kind of mindset still does have any relevance in the 20th and 21st century world.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raghavan. Can I invite Mr. Chaudhary? So in the beginning, I stated that there's this view among many in India's foreign policy establishment that given our size, military strength, and economic power, we are in a situation that we will always cause anxieties among our neighbors. And there isn't really much we can do. There's sort of saying that we are damned if you do, we're damned if you don't. We can't really help our size. Do you agree with that view that it's regardless of what India does, they will always be anxious?
Well, I think the size issue is definitely true. If you look at South Asia, India's dominance, whether in GDP or population, is actually remarkable. We're roughly 2/3, and that includes Pakistan as well as the Bangladesh and so on. We're roughly 2/3 of the GDP of South Asia. In comparison, for example, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, not itself a very small country, is nonetheless only about 1/3 of the GDP of Southeast Asia. And arguably very few countries other than the United States and North America dominate their region to the extent that we do. However, let's put it this way. Yes, we inevitably, given that foreign policy decisions, especially in our neighborhood, are often decided on remarkably short time trajectories and by a political system that will often not be looking too far into the future. And more so than any other foreign policy that we do, has a domestic dimension that it will always make any decisions for India and its immediate neighborhood more political and to some degree often less strategic. So whether the Sri Lankan issue was always very deeply embedded in the concerns about Tamil politics. Nepal itself has an unusual situation given its Madhesi population and their links to northern India. Bangladesh, of course, is half of a former Bengal state. I myself am an example of that. My father's family are from Dhaka, and my mother's side of the family are from West Bengal. And then Pakistan, of course, is in many ways a very different dynamic, but also has its own domestic dimension. So we always, therefore, produce results or produce policies, I would argue, regarding our neighbors, which, while rhetorically are very high-sounding, because we assume that because of the strong cultural and historical ties, there will be an affinity between us and them. And there is definitely that case. I would say that definitely exists, at least between Bangladesh and West Bengal, for example. And some states, some countries, notably Nepal and Bhutan, their population have the right of residency and work inside India. And I'm not certain, but in Nepal's case, I think as much as at any given time, you can have as many as 30 to 40% of the population of Nepal actually living and working in India. And the same thing, I mean, Bhutan is somewhat less, but a fairly sizable chunk of Bhutan's population functions and lives inside India. But as you said, these countries have their own dynamic. I mean, let's put it this way: a simple case of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is 170 million people. In any other part of the world, it's a huge population. This is a population the size of Russia. And it's only because it happens to be next to India that people think that it's a small country. But its GDP is now bigger than Pakistan. Its human development indices are better than India's. And it is now the fastest growing economy in South Asia. So it's not enough to just say, yes, Bangladesh is there and they should listen to us. They are obviously more independent than almost any other country in the South Asia, of our small neighbors, quote unquote, in the neighborhood. I would argue that since the economic reforms began in 1991 in India, we started to see a slightly more sophisticated response to our neighborhood. While you refer to Modi's Neighbourhood First Policy, actually every single Indian prime minister from Nehru onwards has enunciated a neighborhood policy of some variety, and they've all placed a very strong emphasis on the neighborhood. Even if I exclude Pakistan and China, because I've said the dynamics there are obviously different. And in the case of China, it's hardly a country that we can put much pressure on. But if you exclude even those two countries, and Myanmar, I would argue, is a somewhat different game. But if you look at the smaller neighborhood countries, every single prime minister has enunciated a neighborhood policy. And I think since 1991, we've been trying very hard because we believe we now have something more to offer than just culture and sheer size to these countries, and that is an economic benefit of being close to India. And in return, we have basically argued for them to accept should we say, an Indian primacy on security and some foreign policy issues. And there we've gone back and forth to the degree with which these countries are prepared to work with us. And we've also realized, I would argue, that different countries have different policy requirements. Bangladesh has a very different dynamic than from the island states of, let's say, Sri Lanka and Maldives. Nepal is an unusually complicated state of affairs, partly because of its domestic situation. Bhutan, in many ways, is the simplest country that we have had to work with, but it's even there, you're starting to see things to be slightly different. But I would argue, therefore, we're getting better at this policy than we were before, and a lot more sensible about it. But it continues to be difficult. But I think one thing we do recognize is that if our global aspirations to be some sort of a great power, or at least a major net player in the international system, it cannot be accomplished as long as we do not have stability on the bulk of our South Asian neighbors and our South Asian borders.
Thank you. Thank you. So can I invite you, Professor Muni, for your opening remarks? I want to go a little bit further on in terms of like how, so Mr. Chaudhary mentioned that every prime minister has had a policy of the neighborhood, and that's been, and obviously one of the very well-known, well-articulated policies was the Gujarat Doctrine, which, in his own words, was based on the fact that we had two hostile neighbors, China, obviously, with whom we've had an adversarial relationship going back to the 1960s, and on the west we had Pakistan, with whom we have a massive territorial dispute. And because of that, we needed to have a policy of exceptional generosity towards everybody else, so that we could always have peace with all the other neighbors. But now we are in a situation, for the last several years, we've been talking about it, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, all have been tilting towards China. And the general explanation is that we can't match China's financial power. My question is that the entire story? Are they tilting towards China just because China can, because of China's financial wherewithal, or is there more to it? Are they only tilting to China, or are they drifting away from India because of something that India does, India-related factors?
Well, I think too many dimensions have been touched already in your question. I really wanted to start with the whole concept of big brother. And I think this is a flawed concept when applied to South Asia. It's a typically Western concept. Give me half an hour and I'll give you a long lecture on why it is flawed. But the real concept, if you want to use, is big brother, the elder brother, which helps you and which also scolds you when it comes to. And it was very clear, as I'll take the Pramit's argument further, very clear during Nehru's time, for instance. He treated neighbors almost like a part of the family, part of the community, and they indeed were, because most of them were and are part of India in terms of culture, civilization, even geographical contiguity so far as Pakistan and Bangladesh are concerned. Sri Lanka and Maldives and Myanmar were part of the British administrative system at one stage or another. So forget about that. And you found that family approach in very close personal ties between the Indian leadership and the neighborhood leadership. For instance, Nehru was very friendly with UNU, with Bandaranaike, Sukarno. It's a little far, but don't forget, Indonesia is our maritime neighbor. And like that, the relationship evolved, which really came up even during his successors as almost family relationships in some cases. The Nehru-Gandhi family was very close to Bhutto family, to Mujibur Rahman family, to Bandaranaike family, to Aung San Suu Kyi family. You can go on. So this was one stage. And I think Indian policy towards neighbors started evolving out of this familial mode or family mode by the end of the 90s. And this is where, as you said rightly, the Gujarat Doctrine came in. When we started realizing that relationship is far more complex than to be handled in this manner. But don't forget, I mean, Pallavi said, I agree with her, that there was a colonial mindset in the Indian foreign policy. There was certainly a bit of a cursion in Nehru. There is no doubt about it, but only when it came to security issues. Not on political order, not on social order. As Pramit said, wherever you have social problems in the neighborhood, India gets involved because there is a bit of India present everywhere. And this contiguity, therefore, the contrast we must understand, and it's a typical Western fashion to term India as nothing but a hegemon or a dictator. It is an existential reality, again, as Pramit very rightly pointed out, existential reality of India's primacy in the region. You can't avoid it. And all smaller neighbors would be unhappy with a big neighbor. Look at Cuba, America. Look at Mongolia, China. Look at Vietnam, China. We can go on. Therefore, this is not a typically South Asian reality, but South Asian neighborhood is different. in terms of its existence, in terms of its evolution, so far as other regions are concerned. Now, this policy therefore has evolved, and I have a lot to say on the Neighbourhood First Policy. I'm a great critic of that. We'll come to it later. But evolution of policy is important. And one or two more points, very, very briefly. One is that India has been a transformational power in the neighborhood. There is not a single major change which has taken place in the neighborhood without India's active involvement. Positive, negative, whatever it is, we can decide that. And that neighborhood, that transformational role has both positive and it has negative implications, because it actually swung like a pendulum between breakthroughs and breakdowns, between brilliance and blunders. You know, the creation of Bangladesh is a brilliant foreign policy. And it became a blunder within 4 years when we lost Mujibur Rahman. The whole thing got gone. There are several examples of it. The mainstreaming of the Maoist in Nepal was a brilliant policy. And within 3 to 4 years, everybody was abusing India. So, you know, we have swung between, and there are several reasons for that. We will talk about it. So lastly, I said, but when you analyze India's relationship with neighbor, which again hinted by Pramit, don't forget the dilemmas, constraints, and the ambiguities of the smaller neighbors. They have, none of them, I said, none of them have been able to decide and evolve a national consensus as to how close to India is not too close. They want to get close to India, and still they have a lot of reservations about it. And this is where your last question lies in, that there are problems and dilemmas which they have. So they use China. Now we are all talking about China. You forgot during the 50s, they used the US during the Cold War. So anyone who is willing to be used, they used Pakistan, some of them. So anybody who is willing to be used will be used by these smaller neighbors because they have their own constraints. And often in talking about India's approach to neighbor, we forget to mention or take account of that. I'll stop here because I have exceeded my time.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Mani. This is actually, I want to explore some of the things that you mentioned further, but we'll first get Dr. Jahangir's view, and then we will go further with some follow-on questions. Dr. Jahangir, do you agree with the popular claim that India's small neighbors need anti-Indianism for their fledgling nationalism? More specifically, Nepal and Bangladesh come to mind in particular. Oh, I think you just need to unmute. Perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, they do. The small states are deeply insecure states. And it has nothing to do with their fear of anarchy, just the size that makes them very, very, in a way, not so self-reliant. So they do whatever they can mobilize with. So India does the same with regard to America, that a lot of Indian political parties or leaders built their things on anti-Americanism. So I think that's something we don't consider an abnormal situation. Like Professor Muni, I want to go to the whole notion of the big brother or elder brother syndrome. It reminded me of Munshi Premchand's story called Bade Bhai Sahab. I think all big brothers go through that pain and anguish of being in that position. So it's not a pleasant spot because one is, tempted to govern the other, guide the other with a soft hand or a firm hand. So India's reality as a big brother is given. India hasn't really cultivated it to be like that. And this is the only mode of engagement. India does appear too big to any smaller state of the neighborhood. So this relationship is supposed to be full of tensions and full of anxiety from the other's point of view. Like S.D. Muni said, there was a time in India where leaders were sensitive. They were sensitive to the fears of the others. So when Nehru cultivated a family kind of a attitude, he wanted to make them feel respected, equal. And that sensitivity is, I think, serves better strategy. It does help the trust. I don't think personal factor is a good factor to rely upon, because it always ends with the end of the leader. So, but the sensitivity in the diplomacy, sensitivity in the MEA can help that. This is another thing that I just noted yesterday. Kanti Vajpayee wrote an article yesterday for the print, and he really acknowledged the legacy of S.D. Muni as South Asia expert in India. What he pointed in this article, the problems of South Asia for India, where he says that there is a terrible, and he uses a word called empathy. One of the major shortcomings of Indian foreign policy towards any of the smaller states is lack of empathy. India doesn't put itself in the shoes of the other. And that creates the feeling of the bullying. And what happened in Nepal is a remarkable example of it. Whether it was not coming out in support of the public opinion when the monarchy was challenged during 2008 and 9, or not to respect the ideological inner debates of Nepal, Maoism and others. So I think the lack of empathy and a terrible knowledge gap of the other are two major intellectual challenges that really limit our approach to them. You asked the question, is China now a challenge? India, if it works only with aid diplomacy with its neighbors, then yes, China is going to take that, because China has bigger pockets. So the aid diplomacy is extremely, extremely instrumentalist and a narrow tool. It doesn't last long. Somebody else will have more money. What will you do then? You will lose. So I think there is a problem to aid diplomacy, and India does need to recognize that aid diplomacy is not going to be a healthy and a positive approach. Rather, underperformed cultural diplomacy of India could serve better, where there's a greater appeal of Indian way of life in these places. And that's what I think I agree with Pritam. To a certain extent, our domestic issues have also in a way limited our options with our neighbors. Our domestic mess spills over our foreign policy in the region. And we haven't really taken care of our political values, domestic political values. Wherever they have gone out of universal values or human values, neighbors have looked at us with suspicion. And they can then go to America, go to China, go to Pakistan, and do a good bargain with India. So it's a very, very, I think, complex reality, and it's a given reality. I don't think India can get out of it. The only thing I think India can do is to cultivate empathy, understand the other, and respect the other. And second, create good scholarship in Indian universities about South Asian countries. Kanti Vajpayee says, after S.D. Muni, you don't have another South Asian expert that you can call on the panel. You don't have an expert on Bangladesh to talk to there.
So thank you, Dr. Jangi. I want to just, so at the very beginning, Dr. Raghavan had pointed out that some of the our attitude with regards to security had developed back in the 19th century and during the colonial rule to look at these neighbors as buffer zones, and that may have passed down into our current contemporary thinking as well. But it's more, isn't it more than security, and doesn't it go back even further? So India, given from a civilizational standpoint, the subcontinent itself is labeled Indian subcontinent, and Indian culture, Indian history defines the subcontinent largely. So doesn't this naturally create an identity issue for the smaller, relatively smaller modern states who would probably want to define their identity as separate from an Indian identity. And when we go and harp again and again about shared history, shared culture, aren't we kind of annoying them and irritating them because we are making it even harder for that identity, a unique cultural identity for them to be established? In terms of the people-to-people contact, like Dr. Jangid mentioned about scholarships, studying in each other's universities and all, that is fairly limited in contemporary times. So our politicians tend to talk more about historical links and Buddhism and Hinduism. But isn't that a strategy which is serving to the detriment of our relations? I don't know. Do you want to answer that, Dr. Raghavan?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to come in on this. Like, I think, the present moment, I mean, the term civilization sort of seems to be hovering in the air. It's on the verge of everybody's lips. I mean, we really are having like a massive, I think, churning about our civilizational heritage on the one hand, and our identity as a nation state with its kind of with its particular boundary lines on the other hand. So I think, I wanted to say that, look, when we're talking about this, I think we have to kind of acknowledge that there are many problems with thinking about the phrase civilization and civilizational heritage in the first place. Like, I think we have to be careful about how we throw that word around, partly because that in itself is a very loaded kind of very loaded and again quite colonial set of values as well, and I mean, one of the things that's interesting about thinking about the idea of Hindu civilization is again how again, like, as a historian, like, one of the things and there have been a lot of books published about this recently, including, for example, Manan Ahmad and the idea of Hindustan, is how much indebted the whole concept of Hindu civilization is to British understandings, of knowledge systems and religion and civilization in India. So the idea was that you kind of you create this category, you create this term, and you kind of organize knowledge within this region according to this configuration that you've already got beforehand. So there's nothing inherently or innately true about the idea of Hindu civilization in its own terms. It's a concept that kind of comes along and gathers steam in the 19th century. And I think we have to kind of bear that in mind, partly because I mean, it's sort of common sense. It has been kind of criticized from a very wide variety of scholars. So we're not using a term that's that's sort of accepted by all scholarship. We're using quite a contested term when we're thinking about a civilizational heritage and the way in which it should or shouldn't influence Indian foreign policy. And I think, I mean, we should bear this in mind when we're thinking about whether or not or should or shouldn't it applied to be it should be applied to the region today. And I think we have to kind of I think we have to kind of try to prize. I mean, it's one thing to sort of say that, look, we have a market, or we have this security arrangement, or we have this set of political arrangements that we can offer to the neighborhood, right? It's another thing to say that, look, we have this civilizational linkage and expect foreign policy to behave accordingly. So and so I think if we have to be kind of think carefully about whether or not we want to kind of overlay India's foreign policy making onto its civilizational kind of civilizational values.
Thank you. Professor Muni,
Yes.
I wanted to dive into your view as well on this one, because I think this is something that has started from Pandit Nehru's time to sort of emphasize the shared links, the shared history.
No, see, security is inherent in the geostrategy. Even if Curzon was not born, somebody else would have said this is how India's security needed to be carried out. And therefore, Nehru, taking the Curzonian legacy on security, was a part of or embedded into the existential reality of South Asia. as it is. Therefore, that's how I see security. But let me come to this very interesting civilizational aspect. I agree with Pallavi, but from 2014 onwards, the civilizational aspect in our relationship has been emphasized only more after 2014 than earlier. Let me tell you very frankly. Nehru never emphasized civilizational aspect. He talked about security. And where did he annoy the neighbors? He annoyed the neighbors while raising the question of democracy. It annoyed the monarchs and the military rulers. He annoyed the neighbors when we raised the question of, social harmony amongst different castes and ethnic groups. That's where Sri Lanka got alienated from us. That is the point which repeatedly Pakistan has been making again and again vis-a-vis us. So we annoyed them on the modern concepts of statecraft, not on civilizational aspect. Now, civilizational aspects in the present context is so distorted. India's civilization was not a Hindu civilization as it is. Hinduism is the dominant element of it, but the civilization is far more diversified than anything else. We have had Muslims in this country when Muhammad was still alive. Now, if you go back into the history, therefore, what the civilization which we are pleading today is undue emphasis on Hinduism and Buddhism in order to contest China. But the Islam is ignored. And I think India has to own Islam. India contributed to Islam by Devbandi school, by Barelvi school, by various other things. Please look at the character of Islam all over the world on India's west and India's east. The Western Islam is a very turbulent Islam. The Eastern Islam is a very coexistential Islam. And that is largely because it was moderated by India. It is unfortunate that today's India is not owning Islam. And therefore, if at all you want to propagate civilization, it has to be the composite culture and composite civilization rather than one component, howsoever dominant it is, which is being emphasized, which is alienating people. Except for Nepal, there is no other, which feels very closely with Hinduist idea.
But just on that, Wayne, would you agree then that despite the neighborhood first policy, the domestic rhetoric is interfering and sort of like unworking what the goal was?
I will go 2 steps ahead of you, and I would say we are communalizing our neighborhood policy.
Unsuccess. I mean, not even to that many dividends in return. Like it's not
not dividend, the negative dividends. Look at the CAA, the way we have carried it out. Look at every small political meeting in which every opponent of the government is asked to go to Pakistan. There is a huge impact. Look, the domestic politics would always impact your foreign policy. Like Sri Lankan issue or the Tarai issue, which was mentioned about it. But to communalize foreign policy approach, purely on and wherever we have done, we have faltered. In Sri Lanka, for instance, we got closely identified with the Tamils and we never started cultivating the Sinhalese. We are paying for that today. In Nepal, a perception has rightly or wrongly got to happen that we are close to the Tarai people. Everybody in Nepal has an Indian roots. Everyone in Sri Lanka has an Indian roots. But somehow these distortions, and we have not corrected those distortions, partly because the policymakers don't bother about what the academics or journalists are telling them most of the time. Sometimes they do listen, yes.
You mentioned India should own up the Islamic heritage as well, but to some extent, it looks like we are also trying to do that. We do try to position ourselves as the leader of the Islamic world, are going and getting involved with Organization of Islamic Cooperation, positioning ourselves. Do you think it's ad hoc or it's just I wanted to get your view. Like,
The
how do
OIC, well, I think let ask Pramit. I have my own views. Let Pramit or Pallavi or Khivraj come about it, because I'll go on and on and on.
Pramit, do you wanna comment on that? Do you think it's just an ad hoc policy, or
It is an ad hoc. To my mind, it is an ad hoc policy. OIC is an ad hoc policy. We had a Sufi conference, and the idea of the Sufi conference, which was held in 2014, correct me, 2015 or 2014, has never been repeated. All last 7 years, we have been mobilizing either the Buddhists or the Prime Minister has been merrily visiting Hindu temples wherever he goes and raises the question of temples everywhere he goes.
Well, let me just say this. One, I think the cultural, religious element of our foreign policy right now is actually a very small element. The relationship we have now developed in the Persian Gulf, especially with the United Arab Emirates, is actually quite transformational. And that's followed by Saudi Arabia. When I talk to the government officials in both of them, and including the King of Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth, the response is they said, we don't actually care what your policies domestically are. That's totally irrelevant to us. Their interest in India is driven by a larger economic and geopolitical concern. And that is one of the reasons that the OIC has come into play. OIC is fundamentally driven by countries like Saudi Arabia. OIC has been a minor thorn in our side because Pakistan has been able to get the secretariat there to issue statements against us on Kashmir and so on. Now we actually have countries inside the OIC and powerful countries, normally Saudi Arabia, UAE, to some degree Qatar, Kuwait, Egypt, who now are prepared to lobby on our behalf on those issues. It's a minor issue. I don't think OIC matters too much, but the fundamental issue is that our relationship in the Gulf has been transformed, but it has nothing to do with culture or civilization. It has completely to do with very hard-nosed, pragmatic issues regarding the nature of the Persian Gulf. But that's not really part of our neighborhood policy, so I don't think we should dwell too much on that. I'm just going to talk about now about what I would argue is the change that's taking place. We now have countries, as I mentioned, I go back to Bangladesh again. Bangladesh is among the small neighbors, the one that is the only majority Muslim country that we deal with. It's civilizationally Indic, but if you go to Bangladesh and you talk to them about Delhi or Mumbai, it doesn't register for them. They'll talk about Calcutta. For them, that's civilizationally close to them, but they don't think the rest of India is really part of what they're about. But nonetheless, I would argue that our relationship with Bangladesh in many ways has been the only really major success of the Neighbourhood First policy, in the sense that we've had a serious transformation in terms of our security relationship, which is now incredibly tight. I mean, there are probably very few countries now that allow the degree of intelligence and operational freedom to our security systems as Bangladesh does. We also have an incredible trade relationship. Bangladesh exports now over roughly $1 billion worth of goods to our country. And I would say at least in the last 3 elections in Bangladesh, what was noticeable was that even the opposition parties did not raise India as an issue. We have traditionally always been an issue in a Bangladesh election, but today neither the BNP and the Awami fight on other issues, but India is not one of them. The question, therefore, is why did this change happen? And
unfortunate references to termites aside.
Yes, they're angry about that, but that doesn't change Sheikh Hasina's fundamental view that Prime Minister Modi has been very good for her government, because he settled what was the biggest issue with Bangladesh, which was the border. This was an enormous issue with the Bangladeshis. It was something Manmohan Singh they may have liked as a person, but he was unable to deliver. They found that the person who opposed this the most was a fellow Bengali, Mamata Banerjee.
Ramit, the Bangladesh softening started much before the Neighbourhood First policy.
I agree, but we were the first. But I'll tell you, government was the first to deliver on it. I have talked about it.
Partially, yes.
I'm sorry, but actually true.
On land issue, yes, you are right. All other issues, including on the insurgency issue, I think it was a lot of work was done before that.
I agree, it was done before, but it was the biggest browse that Sheikh Hasina had was that I have given you everything on insurgency, but you have refused to give me what I want the most, which is the land border settlement.
And Tista, which is still remains.
I'm sorry, the Bangladeshis don't take that as a major issue. I've talked to the Bangladesh government. They accept that Sikkim has to be brought into that picture. The West Bengal government doesn't. They accept that they said, now we know that Tista is never going to happen. We'll settle. But the border was an issue because it was also associated with another issue, which was the killing of Bangladeshis on the border, which, as you know, was an enormous problem. We used to kill literally hundreds of Bangladeshis were killed on the border in India on a regular basis every year. When I was in the NSAB, we actually discussed how do we do this, and the fundamental problem is we couldn't do anything about it until the border was settled first. So the point is that Sheikh Hasina now is like, okay, I don't care what Modi's doing elsewhere, but at least he delivered something. Manmohan Singh came to Bangladesh, as you remember, on a state visit, promising to do the deal, and then walked away and said, actually, I can't do it because I don't have the power. So for Bangladesh, I would argue right now, this is the core issue, that you delivered on something. And this is what I'm trying to point out, is that as these countries become more powerful, more sophisticated, become, as Bangladesh is a powerhouse, they will look upon less and less about standard things like civilization, personal contacts, and so on. They will say, you have to deliver on hard national interests. If you don't deliver on those, we don't care who or what you are, we don't want to deal with you. So I would say Bangladesh has already reached that level. It's entering that trajectory where they're going to be more concerned about what India delivers on hard things for them. So Bangladesh has already told India, we don't care about what your concerns about China are. We need to buy weapons that are inexpensive and good. You don't manufacture weapons. So sorry, we have to buy Chinese. And there's nothing you can do about it. Second, they've also said, we'll agree. We don't want to be a part of BRI, not because of your concerns, but because the interest rate structure of BRI makes no sense. We're happy to be working with the World Bank. We will take some money from you, some money from China, but we will fundamentally stick with the multilateral financial institutions because that's what Bangladesh is all about. But Bangladesh has announced we're prepared to join RCEP. India can walk out of RCEP. That's not our problem. But for our trade policy, RCEP makes sense. And we will investigate. And India can squawk, but that doesn't matter. Our interests are very clear. RCEP makes sense. So that's where I'm saying that our relationship with at least the country the size of Bangladesh is changing. I would argue Sri Lanka is slowly moving in that direction yet. Nepal, however, remains a very different game. And I think I would say that's a country where it's much more about a more traditional relationship that's going on.
Just going back to Bangladesh, it's amply clear that the leadership there has become much more pragmatic and is much more focused on the realpolitik and their strategic interests. But is the whole belittling and berating attitude or the rhetoric that comes from India, does it really not matter? Does it not gradually filter down through media and everything into the collective psyche of the nation and then reflect in the interpersonal relationships? Another claim that often comes up is Indians act very arrogantly when they deal with their neighbors. There is this attitude you mentioned, I think, earlier in the debate that Bangladesh is a pretty big country. It's at the size of probably bigger than Russia in population, but an average Indian tends to think of these places as very small, insignificant places, despite not really knowing that how fast their economies are growing and everything. And that also becomes a point which also, going back to what you said, India might be gaining in real power, but are we losing in soft power?
I mean, that's probably the case. And I think that what Pallavi mentioned about terminology like termites and our immigration policy has fed into that. Though now Bangladeshis say that if you look at remittances from Bangladesh to India, it's pretty clear that Indians are now migrating to Bangladesh for jobs. Because they are doing much better low-end manufacturing than we are. But soft power in my view, has a very strong limits. The South Asian country, and this extends South Asia's definition, where Indians were the highest approval rating was Afghanistan. If you look at polls by Deutsche Welle, by BBC, by other various other, when Afghans were asked which foreign country do you think is our best friend, India was overwhelmingly number one. That's great, but did it make any difference when the Taliban took over? No, because we had no hard power capacity whatsoever in Afghanistan. We could do absolutely nothing. I remember talking once with Hamid Karzai. He says, yes, we all love you. You guys are great, but you can't do anything for us. You don't know how to manufacture a gun. You can't sell anything to us. You don't have a border with us. So fundamentally, there's very little you can contribute to Afghanistan. So the soft power is great, but in this case, it didn't make any difference. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have soft power, and I don't think this government at least cares too much about that element of it. But I would argue that in a country like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, now increasingly they have a very clear sense of their own national interests, and that will be the final determinant of the relationship.
Thank you. Let me bring in Dr. Jhangi. Indo-Pakistan rivalry dominated India's foreign policy for the better for the better part of the first 5 decades since independence. And have we finally dehyphenated ourselves from Pakistan just to become hyphenated with China? Will Indo-China hostility dominate our international strategy going forward?
Well, in a normal, scheme of things, it will. India will have to act, maybe deal with the strategies that China is employing. And this is where my point, and I think I slightly disagree with Parmeet's assumption that neoliberal and an instrumentalist realpolitik is better than the soft power. Take the example of Bangladesh. I think one of the defining elements in the relationship between India and Bangladesh is India's contribution in its making. I think that cements something very fundamental and not very ancient. It's not civilizational. It's their Independence Day. So I think that does play a role here. The problem with this strategic, instrumentalist, hard power employment of foreign policy is that in a changed situation where there is another powerful rival like China that can offer them more national interest and deliveries, then you lose out. So I think in the region, India doesn't have a greater hard power to change its image, whereas it does have more cultural and attitude capacities to take them into the fold. I don't really underestimate the role of soft power in Iyer. I think India needs it because also India doesn't have enough hard power. The situation in Afghanistan is extremely complex. I agree. Balika Vadhu was one of the most sought after television series in Afghanistan, and it was amazing the amount of love they had for India. But Taliban is not just a change of government. It's actually fundamental change in Afghanistan that's not going to, in a way, be fathomable in foreign policy for some time. But the other neighbors are really not in those radical transitions. But Pallavi, you wanted to say something.
Before you go, we'll get Dr. Raghavan first. No, please, Dr. Raghavan, please come. Then I want to come back to Dr. Jhangi.
Yeah, I actually had wanted to come in a little bit early. I was just going to say that, look, as far as the Bangladesh question is concerned and the stability of that relationship, I also wanted to point out that, I think it's what the unhelpful thing that India is doing is to reopen debates about partition. Again, I speak as a historian. You all know my book stops in 1952. But my own feeling would be that reopening debates about partition is not going going to be a particular help as far as the neighborhood is concerned. And if you look at the poisonousness of the debates about the CAA, the NRC, citizenship, how these kind of 70-year-old issues have suddenly come into the fore, into sort of mainstream political discussion, my sense is that these things are going to be quite costly for India and its neighborhood. And the best kind of way I can demonstrate is that I know that it was costly in the 40s. So logic sort of suggests that it will be again. But I can also see that there's going to be a lack of a trust or a lack of kind of inclination to support India in whatever endeavors, if its domestic rhetoric is so very deeply divisive.
Yeah. So I wanted to go back to your point about so basically, can Dr. Jangid, can India make up in trust and goodwill what China can offer from it with its deep pockets? You mentioned about Balika Badhu. That just got me interested. I was thinking that India has dealt with many of the societal and developmental challenges that are also faced by other South Asian countries. Problems like child marriage, female infanticide, triple talaq, fuss around menstruation. These problems we share with some of our neighbors. And we have a collective intelligence in our governmental and non-governmental organizations, having dealt with them at a scale for many, many decades. Can we use this collective intelligence to help our neighbors? Well, China can give them financial aid, but they can't give them because they just don't have the same kind of issues. They don't have the same history. Does it put like the shared history to a practical use, which would be valued and benefited by our neighbors?
Yeah, these all things add to India's influence. And when I say that culture and the goodwill is needed, I don't want to say that will be just good enough. It won't be good enough. India will have to have tangible benefits. The carrot and the stick diplomacy, where you can't really go without a carrot. Fundamentally, the other is looking at you in a transactional relationship. However, the narrow realist method or methodology to secure yourself anyhow, barring any kind of values, I think that backfires. And I think that has been the problem in many of the neighbors, including Nepal and Sri Lanka. What I mean to say is that we cannot afford to look at our neighbors from our security needs. We might have to step into their shoes and understand what do they need that India can help. And yeah, India can help in all of the social and material incapacities. And India has been doing it. Aid diplomacy in the region has been fantastic, but the aid diplomacy now seems too little comparing to what China is doing. So my point is, our aid diplomacy doesn't really go far.
Yeah, and bringing back Professor Muni. So there is another important criticism of India from the neighborhood is the lack of leadership. The view is that India wants to be the regional leader, but does not take the lead. And this is most evident on the economic and trade front, where the lead should have been taken by India. South Asia remains one of the most unconnected regions. The overall trade, inter-regional trade, is only 5% of the overall trade. And organizations like groupings like SAARC or BIMSTEC have been a failure because India did not respond to its. It should have taken the lead in financing or otherwise take connectivity and leadership, which is why they ended up just becoming forums for anti-terrorism rhetoric, largely aimed at Pakistan.
This allegation of leadership was perhaps true 2 decades earlier, no longer. Why I say so? Because in the recent years also, the satellite issue, the connectivity issue, India has taken the leadership, taken the initiative on security, getting together on trade issues. It has taken together, but I find there are three areas where Indian policymakers need to concentrate if you want to look at it from India's point of view. Let me give you a matrix of what, to my mind, would reshape a neighborhood policy. So far as India is concerned, there are three flaws or three areas to be looked into. One, a casual approach to their sensitivities, which has been mentioned by Khivraj and others. And we will have to look into it. Secondly, the delivery deficit, which Pramit has been talking about. It's not only, it's not the amount of money which is important. And I tell you, the sheen which was there on BRI vis-a-vis China is peeling off gradually because the way projects are coming up. And look, for instance, in Nepal, the whole trade issue has got so vitiated on the Karong border now. And the Chinese are dictating what has to be done, what has not to be done. The Nepalese media may still not raise it, but this is a fact which is affecting their businessmen, which is affecting their people. So the kind of sheen which came out of money from China has its limited utility, and it will get exposed or get into dispute longer. But the delivery deficit, we don't deliver projects on time. We don't deliver to the satisfaction of the targeted people and targeted countries, largely because of our internal system. Yani it's a question of a patch on the road in Delhi, that it will take 6 months or 2 years or whatever else it is. The same happens in our projects earlier. And therefore, they say, what is this India doing? You know, there were 2 hotels which Sri Lanka sanctioned, one to China, one to Sri Lanka, one to India. The Indian ITC is still not completed. The Chinese one is running beautifully. Now, this is where the problem is. So delivery deficit is another one. The third factor, which is not often looked into, the diverse stakeholders in India's neighborhood policy. And many times they are mutually conflicting and incompatible. And there are multiple channels of communication between India and the neighboring countries. And I can reel out half a dozen, if you have time, half a dozen examples of one section of the government of India talking one language from the another section of the government of India to the same country at different levels. But this is a problem. Therefore, the different stakeholders are a problem. Now, having said that, we are focusing on India, all right. And India has to look into these 3 areas in order to improve its neighborhood policy. You know, the whole question of what I call these days is Neighbourhood First 2.0. And in 2.0 is we did a lot of damage in the first one, which is now being repaired and done it. And Pramit, you are right about Bangladesh. You talk to officials, everybody will say things are goody-goody. You sketch the skin and there is a lot of discomfort in several areas. Let us not forget about it. But there are 2 other factors besides India, which in the India's neighborhood policy, we must emphasize. One is the turbulence, political turbulence within the neighborhood, where India gets dragged willingly or unwillingly. The neighborhood stakeholders drag India, and India goes into it, because I remember a great statement which P.N. Aksar once made, that when you talk about interference and other things in the neighbors, we are lodged into each other's intestines. So anything happens in one side would be affecting the other, you like it or not. This is the natural reality of South Asia. That's why I say, you know, this big brother, etc. concept don't work. So one is this neighborhood turbulence. Again, it needs a lot of time to explain. And the second is the external interference. Don't ever forget that there are powers outside which are not interested in India consolidating itself in the neighborhood. China is one, Pakistan may be another, US may be another, somebody else may be there. I'm not going into that. But and there has been a consistent history of that. So if you want to look at the total outcome of India's neighborhood policy, you have to focus on these other aspects as well. including the flaws or the areas of requirement in India's own approach.
So you mentioned two things. Obviously, US is interfering everywhere, but China and relations with Pakistan are obviously very important, where we have border disputes. But until this border dispute with Bangladesh was resolved,
not only that, China is now putting Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nepal together on the Himalayan connectivity corridor.
Yeah, but what I wanted to ask you was the border disputes. Is this, we have before resolving with Bangladesh, we had border disputes pretty much with everyone. Is that what makes, you had earlier said India, South Asia is different than other regions. So many issues around borders. Is that something which is unique to South Asia?
No, we have settled most of the borders. I'm sorry to say, most of the borders have been settled. And the issues which are coming up are very small issues which are being politicized to be inflated. I mean, maritime boundary, look at the way you settled with Bangladesh, for instance, through the arbitration. Look at the way the Indian emphasis on India's nationalism is not territorial nationalism like that of China. India gave Kachhatiu to Sri Lanka. Bangladesh example we just had. Tarai, some portions were given during the British time to Nepal, which is still there. In Pakistan, we were always willing to settle, even today, on the line, the so-called ceasefire line. I can show you real documents after documents where India has been. We did not bother about Aksai Chin earlier. Now that the Chinese have made it more clear, we have no sense of territory. Frankly, this is one of the criticism of India's policy, that in terms of geostrategic importance of territory, we have not really done much. So border is not a major issue. Sometimes it is politicized, yes, to a very large extent. Look, I mean, Pramit said that we have now recently settled the border issue. The border issue was settled in 74. That agreement was initially made 74, not ratified for political reasons. And it was not an issue in India-Bangladesh relations except for a minor reference point. The major issue was water issue at that time. And then the major issue was, of course, because there were change of regimes in Bangladesh in a different way. So anyway, let's not go back into the history and find out. What I'm saying is that territorial issues are not major issues of confrontation between India and the neighbors. What happened to the border issue with Nepal now? Where has it withered away? It is there. No, it is there on the table, but it is not on the political agenda. See the difference between the two. Susta issue, border issue with Nepal, is on the table for decades because the river goes on changing the course.
But there was a big fuss in Nepal when India published the maps showing their region as part of India. They made
the reason was political. Yajur, we don't have time to go into. It was politicized, and that's why the border issue became big. That border issue is pending for last 250 years. Sorry, 150 years. More than 150 years. Even it was not an issue during the king's time. With all the anti-nationalism as the nationalism of Nepal, anti-Indianism as the nationalism of Nepal, the border issue never came up.
So this would support the argument that in neighboring countries, anti-Indian sentiments will be stoked and restoked again and again.
Turbulence within the neighborhood. No neighbor is stable constitutionally and politically today.
Yeah, and whether it is to distract from the government's incompetence or for other political reasons.
India is a polarizing factor in all the neighbors. Pramit is right that during election time it doesn't come up, but it is a polarizing factor because different groups seek favors and confront India differently depending on their own requirements.
Pramit, can India do something about this? Because if the others are just using the anti-India sentiment for their own political reasons, is there anything India can do about it?
Oh, that'll be a long process. As Professor Mooney is completely right. A lot of the problem lies in the domestic politics of those respective countries. Some of it lies in our own policies, but there's a limit to what we can do. After the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, I remember I was talking with the then National Security Advisor, and he was actually very happy. He thought that all of the major players in Sri Lanka now were effectively pro-Indian or at least neutral towards India, including the Buddhist Sangha and so on, who are during the Civil War had become very anti-Indian. Within 2 years, that fell apart. And particularly the Rajapaksas turned against us, largely because we were trying to push a Tamil political settlement. We said the end of the Civil War, you really want to end it, you've got to do a political settlement with the Tamils. They weren't interested. We're still pushing that line. The policy hasn't changed. Rajapaksa therefore then played a China card. He played various other cards against us, some of which worked, some of them which didn't. So that's a purely domestic game. And in Sri Lanka, if you go back a little further, what did Jayawardena do? He played on our sense of hubris, if you wish, and deliberately dragged us into the Sri Lankan Civil War to use the Indian army against a Tamil tiger force that he was incapable of defeating. And there we were played, if you wish, by the Sri Lankans, despite the fact that they were a much smaller country. So yes, it's difficult. I would say Bhutan, it's not too bad, but then Bhutan is a very different case. And you have there, the foreign policy is controlled by the palace to this day. But Bangladesh, in my view, is now becoming much more like a normal country in its sense of national interest. The real issue, I think, really will be what the next generation of Bangladeshi politicians, the two ladies who run the country right now, pass away, whether or not we'll start to see the return of an Indian card, if you wish, within Bangladesh. But my sense is that they can maintain their economic trajectory, that will matter less and less to them. Nepal, however, will continue to always have a very strong political both domestically, and India will be perpetually part of their political game until something is changed in Nepal. But I see that happening for a very long time. And Sri Lanka, I think we've now given up any idea that we'll all have all the major players in Sri Lanka on our side at any point soon. But the Sri Lankans, I think, also now recognize, and this goes back to how much can you use the China card. So the Sri Lankans tried very hard. They got the Chinese to do large amounts of investment. The Chinese didn't do any aid. They did investment. But the problem with investment is it comes as debt. And they now have serious debt problems. They may have handed over Hambantota to China, but 70% of Hambantota's activities are to India, not to China. And India immediately started telling industries, just avoid Hambantota. Hambantota is now effectively bankrupt because their trade with India has been halved and is shrinking literally on a monthly basis. And the Chinese are saying, okay, we got to know what to do about this. But keep in mind, I think the other element that we're now doing much more than we did in the past is that we are bringing in other players to help us in the neighborhood. And there, the number one country we're looking at is Japan. It is not us who is providing the money to Bangladesh, not even China. Japan is the largest aid provider there. The biggest folly the Sri Lankans have done is that by angering us, we told the Japanese, please don't bother to give them any money. And now they're regretting that because the Japanese are by far the most generous aid givers, no strings, lowest interest rates in the neighborhood. Even in somewhere like Southeast Asia, Japanese investment and aid dwarfs the BRI overwhelmingly. But it's Japan that looks to us now for strategic guidance as to where they should go and what they should do in South Asia. And we're seeing other countries coming to us because they're angry with China, including the United States, and saying, what would you like us to do in this neighborhood? That's, I think, one of the big shifts we're starting to see in our South Asia policy, is that we're prepared to now work with third countries, where traditionally we would have said, stay out of this place, this is our turf.
May I say a word on that? I mean, that is a reflection of India's losing confidence in itself to confront the Chinese. On no other issue, we even now, like the US MCC, again, in all the neighboring countries, we are using US, we are using Japan largely because both Japan and US think that India alone cannot handle China, and we are convinced that we alone cannot handle China.
Right. And also, doesn't this solidify the label of Big Brother? Like, if we are providing conditional aid and bringing other partners also to give aid on conditions of India, aren't we meddling even more in the domestic affairs of these countries and further solidifying the label of Big Brother?
Oh,
I don't know, Dr. Jackie, do you want to answer that?
I just want to tell you this, that this position of a big brother is given. I don't think India, it's like really being born before others and bigger, larger age. So that position doesn't really discomfort by itself, provided that the big brother is
we call it
sensitive
India's
enough.
primacy.
Yeah, the big brother is sensitive enough, caring enough, giving enough, and respecting enough. I think if India really deals with the different set of this approach.
You know from where the word Big Brother concept came up?
Please enlighten us.
I know Premchand.
Oh, well.
No, it is a Dada who controls everybody else. Looks on all the televisions, who is doing a mischief, goes and controls them. That is called a Big Brother. That's why I said Big Brother has a different cultural connotation. Anyway, let's not quibble on.
Interference in domestic affairs. So security is the big elephant in the room. India is obviously concerned about its security, which is why a lot of decisions made in around politics and other stuff in neighboring countries matter to India, because India tends to interpret from the lens of how it impacts Indian security. And that's unlikely to change until we have two hostile neighbors, very large hostile neighbors in the north and on the west. So my question is, can we somehow, if there's a view that if India lays out clearly red lines that, okay, as long as these countries do not cross these red lines with regards to India's strategic and security interest, we don't interfere in their foreign policy, what they do with China, what they do with Japan, what they do. Do you think that's feasible? Can we limit our interference in their matters and take a more hands-off approach if we have articulately laid out our red lines with regards to our strategic and security interests? Or would that be a further infringement on their sovereignty?
Who do you want to respond?
Anyone who wants to answer. Why don't we go with you?
Can you define security in that watertight compartment? What affects security today? So for instance, the Sri Lankan ethnic conflict, does it relate with India's security or not? The whole Tarai question in Nepal, is it related to security? The whole question of Duars in Bhutan, where earlier many of the insurgents went and got settled, marrying Bhutanese girls and all that. Is that a part of security? See, it's a very, very complex issue of security these days. It is not simply territorial security that you guard the border and everything is as we earlier put checkposts on Nepal's border with China, that now the security would be taken care of. Now the Chinese are sitting in Lumbini.
But could that be a red line for us, that the Chinese should not have been there? Could we have laid out that, like the way China does that?
And the question of economics would come. They say we are coming to develop Lumbini as a pilgrimage center. Where is the? How do you separate? This. Now look, the Chinese have promised to build a big train road, which is 80% under tunnels. So where did the people will board it? It doesn't go through the inhabited areas. Is it an economic development project, or it has security undercurrents like Hambantota and Gwadar earlier? They were all commercial ports. both Gwadar and Hambantota were promised to be developed as commercial ports.
The other
Yeah,
problem
actually, I
was,
wanted to come in.
sure, go ahead.
Is that? I mean, I just thought I'd say that, that we have to, when we're thinking about this, we, like Professor Muni said, we have to kind of think about what exactly is it that we mean when we say security. And this whole thing about, look, should we, ask Nepal to kind of do X, Y, Z, and if they do this, then what they do as far as China is concerned is not our concern. Like, should we behave like that or not? And I think we have to, when we're laying out this criteria, like, I think we have to be careful not to accept the definitions of security that Curzon himself, I mean, just bring it back again, that he associated security, territorial security, with what neighbors did as far as, rivals were concerned. And I think we have to kind of be careful not to define security that way, and to not to kind of fool ourselves that we're playing kind of the great game part two, particularly in regions like Afghanistan or in our other neighborhood. So I think, I mean, I just wanted to say that, look, I agree as far as what is it that we mean by security, and how should we go about trying to, achieve it as far as we are concerned. The other thing I just also finally wanted to add was that, as far as Professor Muni's point about territory was concerned, I just thought I'd come back and push a little bit, just because, just because it seems to me that territory is, a kind of, for all the ideas about deterritorialized solutions that have been on the table in South Asia right down from the 60s. Every decade, somebody or the other made a speech about, look, how is it that we can kind of take away the idea of territory as far as our dealings with our neighbors. I mean, I would have thought after all these years, like something would have materialized. And the fact that we weren't able to get there shows us that territory does still hold us back as far as our dealing with our neighbors are concerned, possibly according to the framework that again was defined in the 19th century. So I thought I'd stop there.
Thank you. Mr. Chaudhary, you want to make a point?
Yes, about the red lines. I think the only thing about the red lines I'll point out, and we can see this happening with China. China's red lines keep changing, and so will ours. For the simple reason that our economies and our national interests keep changing as well, because we're growing or emerging powers, or however you want to define that. We look at China. China, when it began laying out red lines, it just said, Taiwan, Tibet, and so on. Now it says you can't talk about the origins of COVID. That's a red line. You can't talk about the South China Sea. That's a red line. And they'll keep adding, because they're what they consider to be of core national interest to them will keep expanding as their economy and their interests rise. Very soon, you have a situation, if you're looking at climate issues or electrical vehicles, cobalt supplies will now become a core interest for literally any government that wants to go into electrical mobility. But cobalt comes mainly out of only one country in the world, that happens to be the Congo. So therefore, Congo then becomes a core national interest for any country. So the definition of a red line will always keep shifting. So it's really pointless, I would argue, to sit down and keep saying, hey, look, we're going to do a red line, because in a couple of years, you're going to rip it up and say, actually, no, we got another red line. It's moved. Oil used to be a big red line for a lot of core, not for us, but for other countries, oil supplies. Oil is a sunset industry now, and less countries are concerned about it. Our biggest problem is that nobody wants to invest in oil anymore. So you can't really, I would say red lines is a difficult part. The other point, which goes back to what Kindrad said, is that we deliver horribly. So we're terrible at putting stuff in building infrastructure. We struggle building infrastructure in India. How are we going to do it outside India? So if a country says that we are going to need a port of X and X $billion size, it's not enough for India, and we're going to give it to China. India literally cannot come in and say, don't give it to China, because we'll build it for you, and everybody will laugh in your face and say, you can't build such a port. A simple example is that we have to transship about 70% of our big cargo shipments via Sri Lanka. Why? Because there is no Indian port capable of handling the very large container ships that dominate international trade today. Not one port in India can do that. Sri Lanka's ports are more advanced than ours. So companies have to ship to Sri Lanka, transfer the cargo to small ships, and send it to the Indian ports. So when you have a situation like that, how are you going to go to another country and say, hey, don't build, go to the Chinese to build a big port, a modern port? And everybody look at you, you got ports that are built in the literally 19th century capacity. Why are you even coming to talk to us about these? So, we have to accept our limitations. When Professor Muni says, and this comes to the issue that Professor Muni also said about the fact that we accept that we can't handle China by ourselves, that's completely true. China is now a GDP 6 times our size. And I think it's a perfectly realistic assessment on the Indian side to accept that you're dealing with a superpower that no longer sees you, is interested in getting a modus vivendi. When you talk about, you're saying about hyphenating India and China, talk to the Chinese about that hyphenation. They get really angry. I've talked to Western scholars and they say, if you ever say India and China to a Chinese, they say, India for them is like what Pakistan is to us. And it's literally that small as far as the ratio of GDP. So this is a country that does not know how to build a train that can run at 100 miles an hour. This is a country that can't build a VLCC port. This is a country that is incapable of making a revolver or a gun, a rifle. And you are comparing this to China that is building has 2 5th-generation fighter projects at the same time. And the Chinese just say, please don't insult us. So we accept that that's a reality. And that's one of the reasons we have to work with other countries to handle China.
Understood. That brings me to the concluding question for each of you today. It has been argued that better relations with neighbors will unshackle India from its neighborhood and allow it to pursue global ambitions more vigorously. What would be your prescription for India to improve relations with its neighbors? Can we start with you, Dr. Jangi?
Well, thank you. I think I go back to yesterday's article of Kanti Vajpayee. 2 things India needs to do: cultivate empathy in addition to the strategies. Strategies can fail. Failure of empathy is less likely. Second, cultivating scholarship of the region that can help India's foreign policy formulators. The third thing, because China is inevitably part of this conversation, I go back to what the American advice was about, American diplomat George F. Kennan, who said the best way to deal with Soviet Union for America in 1948 and 1950 was to just do what America is known for: a liberal international order and a democratic, multicultural, open society. It's the democratic fabric of, let's say, the American side that Kennan believed will actually outdo Soviet Union's durability, which was based on homogeneity and an autocratic rule. The same goes with China. I think Pramit is right. It's good to accept that you are no more in the race, but it's also good to know that you don't have to compete with hard power. India needs to build an international liberal world that Nehru envisioned India should be part of, and India should work on its democracy more and more. Eventually, that will make us better off.
Create a society that seduces our neighbors. Dr. Raghavan, what would be your prescription?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just going to go back to what I was saying a little bit earlier about the, I think the best thing for India's neighborhood policy at the moment is not to reopen kind of founding myths about partition, and not to kind of go back to 70-year-old debates about partition, what caused it, who was responsible, and whether or not, the third generation kind of descendants of these questions have to kind of ally with one or the other.
I wanted to bring this up with you. So when there are a lot of people who think that we have buried a lot under the carpet when it comes to these things, which is creating room for a lot of hateful rhetoric that you see prevalent on social media these days. So it might actually be better to revisit some of these debates, not to take any revenge or anything, but to sort of get a closure for so many people who have a collective memory which did not get the closure. I don't know what your view is on that.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. What I want to say about that is that this whole thing of buried things under the carpet, it depends on who you mean is burying things, right? And one of the really interesting stories, things about partition that, the survivors of partition in 1947 is that you often kind of, you're often talking about a very pragmatic, stoic, and compromising set of people, and the best example I have about this, for example, is if you look at the experiences of abducted women, who literally kind of bore the consequences of partition, on themselves. And the kinds of things that they asked for their, to their governments usually concerned things like rehabilitation, jobs, resources. I mean, when they were being rehabilitated, if they chose to, these are the kinds of things that they said. They never said that much about, a neighborhood policy or India-Pakistan relations or seeking kind of, vengeance on, I mean, they never had those sorts of contributions to make. And it seems to me that to piggyback on that kind of historical voice today by people who descend, by descendants of this experience who are trying to give it a different political value from what it actually was. It seems to me that that's not necessarily the best way of reconciling, oneself with the questions of partition, and to give it a different political face in the moment, which it may not necessarily have had at the time, seems to me to only further, worsen the neighborhood as it is right now. I mean, it doesn't seem to be good for anybody.
Thank you. Very clear. Mr. Chaudhary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, just to look at some of the more hard-nosed things that we need to be doing with our neighborhood. And this is basically the small neighbors, if you wish. We'd have to recognize there's no one-size-fits-all policy. The trajectory of a Bangladesh or a Sri Lanka or a Bhutan or Nepal are actually very different from each other. And therefore, we have to adjust policies to accordingly. This makes, to some degree, a multilateral or a regional multilateral structure somewhat difficult. Bangladesh is a country that we should be working out a very
Did we lose Mr. Chaudhary? Not sure.
Yeah, it's very unusual, but it looks
like
he lost the connection.
Okay, that's fine. Hopefully he can join in a few minutes. Can we go to Professor Muni? So what would be your perspective?
I would repeat what I gave you, the metrics. Sorry.
Mr. Chaudhary is back. Let him finish, and then we'd like to conclude with you, sir.
Just saying that in Nepal, we need to be started working on trying to integrate the welfare systems that would develop, because the digitalization of both identity and the welfare structure in India will make the traditional Nepalese residency rights extremely difficult. And either we integrate Nepal into that and make the case to them that they need to be starting to do that. They can have a separate carve out within it to be done. Otherwise, we are going to have exactly the same problem which has happened, for example, in the European and other countries, that once your modern welfare systems came into place, you immediately imposed anti-immigrant restrictions and closed your borders down, because modern welfare systems, digital identity, do not go with an open border unless there's a degree of compatibility. And that's something in the long term we should be, in the medium term, we should be looking at. And then finally, I think another point is connectivity. We just, as you mentioned earlier, intra-trade, inter-movement between the South Asian countries, even within India, is pathetic and needs to be transformed into something much, much more genuinely mobile and easy than it is right now.
Thank you. Professor Mani, can I invite you to?
Well, I'll repeat what I said, the metrics which I gave you. We have to have greater sensitivity towards the sensitivities of our neighbors. The casualness with which many diplomats deal will not really do. We will have to harmonize the diverse and different mutually conflicting stakeholders which are there. And we have to improve the delivery capacity, which means building capabilities, as it was mentioned very rightly. But at the same time, I have been pleading for a long time that so far as the internal turbulence in the neighborhood is concerned, we must have a special envoy dealing with the political matters, and the embassy should be left to deal with bilateral relations. But that's a small structural suggestion which has not found favor with the MEA so far, but I very sincerely feel it. And lastly, Mr. Kivraj mentioned about the propagating culture and all that. Absolutely fine articulation, my dear. But you are hitting at liberal institutions within your own country. See, it is the good practices, best practices which people will learn. For instance, if your members of parliament are throwing, sprays into each other's eyes, you can't go and teach democracy to others. What you can do is only provide electoral machinery and all that. So, and look at the liberal and liberal constituencies under a strong attack within India. And if that being so, how can you tell others to be liberal? You are not going to say this is, the government is not wedded to that ideology at the moment. And therefore, you can't really convince others that this is what they should be doing. I have done a book on the democracy dimension of India's foreign policy. And that tells you that where do we make compromises, why do we make compromises? So it's fine. Thank you.
We can only preach what we practice. Thank you all of you for this very informative session, for sharing your insights with us. This was very enlightening for me and for everyone involved. Thank you.
Is there any way you give a link to us later on,
Definitely.
or since it is recorded?
In fact, if I may request you, after this session, if you could share any recommendations you have, books or movies around this.
I'm not going to write anything. I'm sick of writing. But there are others who can do this.
So we would love to share those with our audience, just in case they're interested in further reading on this subject. That would be helpful. Thank you.
You should share the recording.
Definitely, we will. We will publish it. Thank you. Namaskar.